the century begins, well, you may recognize Henry Ford on the right, this dapper young race car driver, actually. He was pioneering with his little cars in the Detroit area, and at the time this picture was taken, had a couple of companies that actually failed, but he was very persistent. The gentleman on the left is a guy named Stephen Tenvordi, and he was a blacksmith up in St. Cloud, got into bicycles, and one day a Stanley Steamer car drove through town. He looked at this thing and said, blacksmith and bicycles? Well, maybe there's a whole new horizon out here that I better get involved with. So he ended up going to a convention in Chicago of early automobiles and bicycles, kind of that transitional period. And he must have run into Henry Ford. He was not an exhibitor because at the time, the Ford Motor Company was not even in existence. This is 1903, early 1903. Because within a couple of weeks, Stephen Tenvordi and Henry Ford, through their lawyers, signed a contract to be the first dealer of what would become the Ford Motor Company. At the time, it was, just for holding purposes, Ford Mobiles or something to that effect. So Stephen Tenvordi gradually got out of bicycles and became one of the preeminent Ford dealers in the country. Their family, now the fourth generation, is still very, very active and successful up in St. Cloud. Dealerships are a very, very important part of the Ford story. So Stephen Tenvordi continued to sell bicycles along with his cars. In fact, he didn't even sell a Ford car, for the entire first year that he was a dealer. Not one car. And he also sold other brand cars. Maxwell, you see it there on the left. And as was the tradition of most dealers, so that's a Maxwell car on the two ends, and that's a Ford Model N, and that's I think that's a T. But so most dealers had to hedge their bets, did a little bicycles, did a little this, did a little that, and certainly carried all the cars that they could get their hands on. There's a little bit of a different kind of franchise practice at the time. But Henry Ford really pulled out all the stops, and his company just leaped to the top of the entire industry. He started way behind. There were maybe 50 companies making cars, but within a very few years, he ended up making half the cars in the country. It was just an unbelievable success story from his purpose. So early on, here he is in Detroit making 1,000 cars a day, which was great. Now, but that brings a couple of challenges. One is you got to sell them. Number two is you got to figure out the logistics of getting all the supply parts in that you need to make the cars, and then the finished cars out. And that is not an easy task when you think about it. Okay, so they would make the little pieces and stuff them in the trains, and in a short period of time, Detroit became so congested that their rail infrastructure, because of all the car manufacturers were centered right there, they couldn't even get the rail cars in and out. But this is the way it would have worked. And here's a picture in Spring Grove in southeast Minnesota. And the cars would be just kind of brought to the platform in these little towns all over the country. The dealers would show up with their employees, family or whoever, take the pieces off the rail car, put them together, and drive them right down to the dealership. I believe this dealership is still in business too. That's Onsgard in Spring Grove. So Minnesota was just one of every state. Ford was really actively expanding, and again, he didn't have dealers, he didn't have assembly plants outside of Detroit. But this picture, I know is hard to see, but at the time, in 1909, was the longest car train of cars ever shipped anywhere. And I forgot exactly how many, but it's like 43 rail cars packed with Fords for the various dealers in Minneapolis. So these would have been brought to a building that is still standing, that the Ford leased in 1912. This is over by the Viking Stadium. Beautiful building, still standing.
Baseball
stadium. Yes, the Twins. Thank you. Stadium. You're right. And this is how primitive it was. Mill construction. This is 1912. Not a very sophisticated assembly operation. I think there were 7 tools, and people would just basically put it all together like a kit. Well, given the fact that you've got this tremendous built-up demand for cars all over the country, you've got this rail congestion in Detroit, which made it impossible logistically to get things in and out. Ford came up with this plan to rapidly expand, and within a couple of years, he built plants, like 20 of them, all over the country. 2 in Minnesota at this point, including what we're going to see here in a second, which would be Minneapolis, and you'll see St. Paul right here. Now, obviously, he didn't need one in Minneapolis and St. Paul, but he was smart enough to know that you can't put a plant in one city without alienating half of your market. So there was quite a rivalry between the 2 cities as to which was to get the main plant, and Minneapolis won. St. Paul got the consolation prize. But there you see the array of them built pretty much all at the same time. So here's a close-up probably of a little bit different period. You see Minneapolis in the lower right. To my knowledge, the tallest building ever built for the purpose of assembling cars. This is before the assembly line, a whole different operation. I've seen many of these personally. I believe all of these are still standing. Of the original 25 in that kind of batch, to my knowledge, only 2 have been demolished. They're trying to demolish the one in St. Paul. We'll get to that. This is going to be a little bit more emphasis on architecture than some of my other presentations, but I certainly want to make sure we cover everything that people have an interest in. Most of the plants were done by John Graham, the gentleman with the mustache on the right side, who was from Seattle. He probably met Henry Ford in like 1909, I think. There was a World's Fair out there, and Ford had a race to inaugurate the opening of that, is my guess, is how they finally connected up. So John Graham was the principal designer for 14, 15 of these 20, let's say. And the gentleman on the left is Albert Kahn, very famous, probably one of the most significant, important industrial architects in history, based in Detroit. And both were immigrants. Graham came from Liverpool, and Kahn came from Germany. And both were obviously, at the time, virtually all the architects at the time were steeped in some classical training, whether it was through an apprenticeship or through academic training. Kahn basically worked his way up, starting as an apprentice at a very young age, I'm going to guess. Yeah.
Behind Kahn on the wall there is
Pantheon.
A photo of the rotunda at the University of Virginia.
I think that's the Pantheon.
That
Pantheon was
I think that looks like the Pantheon, but I believe that is the rotunda.
I will check on that. Interesting. I'm curious about it.
Designed by Jefferson.
That could be. But I know they're very similar, and that's really the subject of my book, which is this notion of replicating, copying, counterfeiting, incorporating, paying homage to various things. So I'll have to look into that. I just assumed that was the Pantheon, because I do know that Kahn in particular used to travel, as many of these successful artists of the time, and make these trips, the grand trips to Europe, to actually sketch out the classical architecture. So but I'll definitely check, because that's an interesting point. So those are 2 principal architects that I'll be talking about. These 2 folks overlapped in so many ways, and I want to just touch on this. Albert Kahn set up a company called the Truscon that made parts for what was becoming the whole new technology, mostly of reinforced concrete. And he provided the windows, which we'll see in a little bit, for the Minneapolis building. So even though John Graham is the architect the designer, the principal architect and designer for the Minneapolis and St. Paul plant, Kahn did have his presence felt because he supplied some of the parts. Now, I'll just mention this because it's such a fascinating topic, but part of the reason I believe that architects like Kahn got into these ancillary businesses was, besides hoping to make a profit, but he did not really, he could not advertise. Back in those days, there was a very strict code of ethics in the architectural community that prohibited advertising. It was just unseemly. And in fact, they couldn't even put their sign up on a building under construction. However, both Graham and Kahn and some of the other notables of the period managed to affiliate with manufacturers of very successful nationally known products. And here's the Truscon, who takes this ad out for their United Sash, which we're going to see in a minute. And right down here, so even though that's Kahn family, Kahn had 3 brothers who were in the business. He also gives credit to John Graham. So this fascinating overlap between the mercantile business side, if you will, of the construction versus the artistic gentleman side where you don't dabble. In fact, it would be completely frowned upon. You'd be in a lot of trouble. So I mentioned the windows. The Truscon company probably made 100 products. They made just so many different things, a lot of which they invented. His brothers were, two of his brothers were engineers, and the third was kind of an architect. So they all would get together, although the business were theoretically somewhat arm's length. So these are the kind of windows. This was very, very important innovation because as you're going up and you're getting into this kind of intricate manufacturing, what you really need is a lot of light. And the artificial lighting was not adequate at the time. So that was very, very major in terms of opening up the interior. And that would be a typical thing. Can you see these slides? Is that kind of visible back there? Now, the third gentleman I'm going to be talking about is from Chicago, Theodore L. Condren. He's an engineer. He was an engineer. And he was very, very responsible for a lot of the reinforced concrete that was being introduced. So those are the 3. Now, here's Condren's work. So Condren was brought in probably by John Graham, the Seattle guy, to do the structural engineering for all this new reinforced concrete stuff. This is the Chicago plant. Unfortunately, this was an amazingly important plant because it introduced this wide open craneway space. You can see it where the train's right here, and there was a way to load materials all the way up. And of course, the big skylight in the middle would bring light right into the entire building. But John Graham is right here listed as the architect, Condren Company engineers. Again, this is where these professionals are able to kind of slip their name into the advertising world. And even Condren had to create his kind of trademark Acme designs for the type of reinforced construction he did. Well, here we are looking at Minneapolis. We're standing on 5th Street looking north, although the cardinal points there are so confusing. I've seen it written 100 different ways, north, south, east, west. But there is the train trestle there of sort. I don't know if it's still there, but the tracks are underneath us here. And there we have concrete. So in the year before, Ford was renting space in a typical mill construction building, which was the big, heavy-duty wooden posts. The world has just changed, just like that. We're talking a couple of years, things changed dramatically. Concrete was a great material, structurally incredibly strong. After it had set, because it's monolithic, that's to say that all of the parts are fused into one solid mass. Really, really strong. The joints can't pivot. It's very, very strong. There were some drawbacks. You can see you basically had to build a whole wooden building in order to provide the structure to pour the concrete. Yeah. And the other thing is, It took a little while to set. You had to figure out how to put the molds in and things like that. The biggest problem, and again, this is all new stuff. This is happening on the fly, trial and error. Nobody knows really. I mean, you can try to test it in the field, but the conditions change so dramatically because of the various ingredients in the concrete, the temperature, all of the above. So, but anyway, here we're looking at the 1914. It started in late 13. You can see it's definitely most of these heavy-duty materials are brought to the site, horse and wagon. So that's reinforced concrete right there. Inside, what we have, they call this the girdleless. There's no, the benefit of reinforced concrete is it's a flat slab. So you don't see the beam. What they have instead is this mushroom cap right here that flares out, that is all tied into the floor slab above. Tremendous benefits to that. It gives you a lot more usable space without having to work under the beams. Allows more light to come in and out and be diffused throughout. So that's the end product. That's the building. It started out actually being planned as a 4-story building, and again, the company is growing in such leaps and bounds. Then they said we're going to add another 4 floors, basically as they're starting construction, and then finally they added 2 more. So most of these buildings were structurally designed so they could keep going up. This is the tallest one ever. So it's a relatively small footprint. We're talking about a 1-acre site, and you can see it right on the train tracks. That's the trestle bridge right there. You're going to see the platform right here. The train would go inside where they could load the materials. We're talking a lot of materials coming and going. There's the platform to unload. Just on the other side is the Twin Stadium. And this was a complicated project to put together. Ford got into all kinds of nasty lawsuits with his neighbors because when he bought up the site, he basically cut off some of the surrounding property owners to the north from rail access. And this thing dragged on for 15, 20 years. State Supreme Court, all the way up, back and forth, back and forth. It was a very, very difficult, challenging problem. And it's kind of indicative of the challenge of doing manufacturing in an urban area. This is the roof.
Can I ask, how do
Sure.
you take a train engine into a building?
And back it out.
Yeah.
They must have had some kind of little locomotive that would move them, shuttle them back and forth.
Okay.
So this is not
They
a.
wouldn't be chugging along.
Oh, you mean how do they actually get it in there in the first place?
Yeah.
Oh, with a little locomotive. But let's see if I can go back. I want to show you this. You see this thing right here, that opening? Well, it's a pretty tight squeeze.
Yeah.
And after the building was designed and under construction, the state had passed the Railroad Safety Act to protect workers who were getting killed by being stuck in between tight rail cars and with ceilings. And this was not allowing for enough ceiling height. So Ford actually had to go get an exemption to let him build it as it was. The other interesting that's kind of ties into that, I don't think I have any pictures, but the main level on the street at 5th Street up there is right off the sidewalk. But later on, if you know the area, you know the building, the entrance is now about 2 feet below the sidewalk, the main entrance, because they raised the trestle just to allow more clearance for the trains underneath. So again, it gets very, very complicated when you're working in a city and you got all these moving parts with roads and everything else. So beautiful building. It's got some elements that you're going to see repeated on virtually all of the 20 or so. We're going to, of course, look at St. Paul, but some of the others that were basically part of a kit of parts that the architects could cut and paste to put together. Huh?
You were going backwards.
Well, I should be going forward.
Right hand one is.
I am doing a right hand one. Oh, I must have been hitting the wrong one. Oh, I was here talking about this. They actually would try. They would test their cars up on the roof. So it was a concrete slab, and you can see the freight elevator. So they're jammed into a very tight spot. They have no place to store cars. Basically, this was just in time. He used that expression if you're familiar with manufacturing, vertical manufacturing, just in time. Nothing would sit there. Nothing. No parts. They're in and out. And God help you if there's a rail strike or something like that, because things really get gummed up. So here's some views on the inside. You see the big sash windows. You can see the really primitive kind of setup there where the various pieces are put together. There's no sign of an assembly line yet. Wonderful pictures of some of the workers, and you can just tell if you look closely at the various garbs and the hats and the mustaches. We've got quite an international group of immigrants working here. The other thing, I think you can see it here, is these columns, especially in some of the larger plants, they had to be numbered and lettered, so that because half the workers, 3/4 of the workers didn't speak English, they had to know where they were going. And so this was kind of their international system of communicating. So how did they operate before the assembly line? Gravity. And that's why the 10-story building made so much sense. They would put the little parts on the top, assemble them into pieces and sub-assemblies and modules, and then kind of work their way down. So there were a couple of companies, actually, national companies, that were started right here in Minnesota, mainly because of the rails yards around here, that had all manner of conveyors and these roller conveyors and things of that sort. I don't have a picture of any from the inside of the Ford building, but I know enough about all the others in general. This is actually a picture of a plant in Philadelphia built at the same time. By now, the building had been converted during World War I into manufacture of helmets, Army helmets. But here you can see a kind of a ramp coming down with the helmets sliding down. So you get the picture how these parts would start at the top and kind of work their way down. That's the Philadelphia building. Now this is really strange that you couldn't get more different from the Minneapolis building in the sense that we've got this very strange shape. When you're dealing with cities, you take what you can get. But if you notice, and by the way, this building was designed by Kahn. Most of them that I'll be talking about were designed by Graham. And there's another important point here, which is it seemed that the company had a certain architectural style or brand that both architects ended up using and sharing, and some slight modifications. So here you can kind of see, and this is back to Highland Park, the Kahn building, where as the pieces get really big, you just roll them down from the second floor right out the window. Yeah, Dick.
Is that Philadelphia building one narrow building all the way, or is it triangular?
It's a triangular building, so it does flare out in the back.
It's narrower than it actually
Yeah, you're looking at the very narrowest part. It does flare out, but it's still a triangular building. It's obviously very strange. You think about how they could be making cars and getting parts in and out of there. So that's how they would get. Now notice also the hand trucks. No assembly line, no electrical power. Everything is being pushed around or rolled down. Okay. Now this is the way it would have looked. It's a Louisville plant, but I'm assuming this is very much exactly the way Minneapolis would have been. The workers would move around the car. Later on the assembly line, the workers don't move. The car moves. Here, this is just an old-fashioned putting things together. That's the way they made wagons. That's the way they made stuff for hundreds of years. The big lights, parts all over the place. Most of the important work is done right next to the window so they could see. So you wouldn't want to get too deep in these buildings because the inner part wouldn't have enough light. They're starting to kind of do a little improvised assembly line, and now you're starting to see conveyors coming down from the ceiling. This is also in back to Highland Park. Things starting to move on tracks. As this was going on, we're talking mid 1914. early 1914. They're still building the Minneapolis plant. They're like in the 6th floor. They've come up with a system that now has completely rendered a 10-story building that was based upon the gravity power a complete white elephant. It's completely obsolete. Assembly line, single story. Workers sit right there and the parts move to them under some power. This is back to the Minneapolis plant. You can see they tried to squeeze in a little piece of the assembly line here and there, but it's really patchwork. It's not enough. The typical later assembly plants, not that much later, we're talking 10 years later, the assembly line would be 1,000 feet long. We're talking 60 feet. It ain't going to work. And Ford just keeps selling so many cars. He just has to keep coming up with better ways to make the cars. So let's shift over to St. Paul. Building is still there. If you notice, this is on an urban street. The Ford building was exposed on all 4 sides. So they had light, all 4 sides. Of course, the train came below. This one would have had to be designed so that buildings, with the kind of a party wall, so that buildings would be on both sides. So how do they get light in the middle? You have to do one of these little light well areas cut out. So that brought light into the middle. But very, very similar stylistically with many of the same kind of detail treatments. Some variations, but you can spot these buildings. I've just, on occasion, gone into cities without even looking for it, and all of a sudden, oh my God, that's a Ford building. So you can definitely spot some of the things. It's got very trademark. Well, most of them have this beautiful entrance. It's all brick, nice red brick with terracotta, and some of them are flat across. Some of them have these little segmental arches. The cornice on the top is usually quite flat and plain, but it does have some color. I think we'll see some of those. And in part, that worked very well because if you were going to add floors, the cornice would have not worked. So they could just keep going up, and they would keep those as it was. So by this time, the St. Paul plant was only used for a couple of years. Then they did make a few cars, but it was pretty much a token gesture. As I said, it was a consolation to St. Paul. By now, it's a dealer. And this building was designed to allow for cars in, cars out. By now, you see the big plate glass windows here in the first floor. These are actually wood windows. To my knowledge, this is the only one of the 20 that had wood windows. And again, they must have been thinking right from the get-go, don't tell St. Paul, that this was not to be really heavy-duty manufacturing. This is the building in Seattle, designed by John Graham, who was really the one who was then brought to Ford to work full-time on the rest of them. But you're going to see how identical virtually this is, other than St. Paul is 3 floors. This has got another 2 more. St. Paul has a little bit broader front. It's got 5 bays. This has got 4 with some smaller ones there. But that's the entrance to St. Paul. Really elegant. Just patches of color here and there. Just to make a point about the structure here and the pattern and give some relief. It's really one of the most wonderful things. That's the Seattle one. I mean, it's basically the same building. I mentioned it's kind of a kit of parts, and you could do it on this little triangle building, flat iron building in Philadelphia, or you could do it anywhere. So they tried to get buildings with the corners or as much space around it to allow the light in. This is an example of the construction going on. This is the reinforced concrete. You're going to see some forms here for the mushroom capitals that are flared out. And this is in St. Paul. We're looking, that, if you know it, that's St. Agnes, so I'm pretty sure. So we're looking kind of northwest. And this would be probably the 2nd floor. The reinforced concrete, really strong. But you see, there's quite a lot of work to get it going, to get it set up. Once it's set, it's perfect. But I should also add, there were a lot of failures. Buildings collapsed, including a con building used with this truss con. And people died and these kinds of things. So it took a while, and we're talking 10, 15 years, doing a lot of experimentation, a lot of weight testing, a lot of engineers coming up with formulas. The pressure was always on, build the strongest building with the least material and for the least cost, the least construction time. So, you know, they always push the limit. Here's a sign, a detailed sign that you can see on the of the construction of St. Paul. So that's where I got this guy's name, Acme Systems. I spent years trying to learn more about it. So that's the St. Paul. You can see it's the whole thing is monolithic concrete all the way across, and I believe that the walls are also poured in place. So this is a solid building. But I also want to point out, there's the column being delivered on a horse wagon for an automobile plant. The most important automobile company. So this is a fascinating time. There's no question about that. But that gives you a good idea of the system. I'll throw this one in. This is, anybody been up to Fargo? That's the former Ford plant in Fargo. The building is still there. But you can see it's virtually identical. Some of them have the columns, most of them, half and half. And some of them have this overhang here and more of a flat entranceway like that. Near the state capitol, he really wanted to make sure that it was top of the line. So that's the buildings. Let's talk about the rest of the Ford century. Well, you're making 1,000 of these cars a day. You're selling hundreds of thousands of these cars all over the place. There were no roads. Nobody knew how to drive. Nobody knew how to take care of a car. So what separated Ford from the rest of the pack is he created a system of service and sales that could assure these novice drivers and farmers and doctors that they're there to protect them when they buy the car. So many of these car companies were like startups. They would fade away in 3 years, and here's the guy spent his entire life savings, can't get parts. So Ford made sure that there was a service thing in every town in America that had a population of more than 5,000. That was in Minnesota, that one. Here's one, the Gertie Company, that was on Lake Street. This was, they did sell Ford cars. You can see here the sign. But they were also selling motorcycles and other car companies as well. It's in the 1122. I don't think the building is still there. I'm sure I went looking for it one day. The Gertie Company. This was the inside of the repair shop. Now, if this wouldn't give palpitations to anybody bringing their car in to get fixed. So Ford knew he had a problem, but he was so busy making the cars, he really couldn't get around to figuring out how to rationalize the sales and service. So he's still using kind of dealers and still hoping that somebody out there in Sheboygan knows how to fix the cars, but he kept making the same car over and over again, so it's not like they had a learning curve every year or two, and the parts were all interchangeable for 19 years. You bought the first car, and 19 years later, the last car. The same parts could basically fit into everything. But Ford looked at this and said, oh my God, we have to bring the same kind of precision that they had on the assembly line to the repair. So he tried to rationalize it. It didn't go well. It was very complicated. Dealers revolted. But Ford kind of persisted. Here's a dealership that was on University Avenue, the Owens. This is also pretty close to the state capitol. The family's still around. The building is still around, although it's been substantially modified. But here's a building up in Brainerd, the Woodhead dealers. Anybody know it? Brainerd, the building? Well, the Woodhead family, that was their parts area. just to contrast that with Gertie, you can see how Ford would have loved people like John Woodhead, because everything has got a part and a place and a number, and nice and easy to find all the stuff, and nice and neat. Henry Ford was a real neat freak in his plants and everything he dealt with. Well, the Woodhead family later moved their operation down to Lake Street, the Woodhead company. So for a while there was a lot of lawsuits and nasty business between Ford, who was very rough on his dealers, and could they use the Ford name on their displayer. It really was way, way messy. But I'm not sure if this building is still there. I think it might be. See, at the time that he finished the Minneapolis plant, he was actually Ford was selling cars in the building. So in effect, he was starting to compete with, and he tried to essentially eliminate all of the sales offices, keep it all in-house. He wanted everything in-house. So you can see it's a very beautiful display area, geared up with the beautiful hunting heads and fish and everything else. You know, this was a very major thing for these recreational drivers to know that they're coming into the right place. Schmelzel took over the Ford plant in St. Paul. So he sold cars. He was a dealer. Got into a nasty lawsuit. I had the legal papers, which provide an unbelievable window into the relationship between. But he also sold tractors. So he was simultaneously a dealer and a distributor. So to sell his Fords and tractors, Ford opted to set up a distributorship system where these tractors could be placed at various locations all around the country. So this was during, the First World War, and the tractors were very important. So that's kind of the quick look at the dealers. Now, who else is in this Ford century? Well, when you make a car for 19 years, and people are buying it, everybody sits home thinking, I could add this to that car and make it better. All these aftermarket accessories. This was huge. We're talking thousands of companies did nothing but make products that would fit on to the Model T car. Think of an app. Okay, this is what it was. It was the ultimate mashup. He put the Model T out there, and everybody figured they're going to do something else. Well, initially he didn't even put the body on it. So there were a bunch of companies, most of them located right near the Ford plant, so you could go in there and buy the chassis and walk across the street and get your body. Here's one, Washington Avenue. I believe this building is still there. That's the Martin Perry bodies. Now, eventually, Ford, again, would take it all in-house. But at the time, he's expanding, so, he just couldn't do it all. So, but there's so many different products, whether it's tires, or whether it's in Wyzetta, Minnesota, don't freeze, keep your feet warm. A lot of these cars didn't even have heaters. Most of them in the early days didn't even have a top or windows. So every imaginable product that you can think of, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of accessories. At first, Ford welcomed them because it kind of made his car the ultimate mashup. But it started to get complicated. Ford he said he invented the modern age, and he did. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Henry Ford and his peculiar way of looking at things. He was a genius, there's no question about it, but there were some very dark spots in his history. Certainly the anti-Semitism. I'm not going to dwell on it. We all know about it. It enabled the rise of Hitler, gave credence to all of the anti-Semites and prejudiced people of the time. But he was not alone. Back in those days, this was a very serious issue. But he did give cover. That created problems. If you're a dealer and trying to sell cars, you don't want to be embroiled in controversy. So even in Minnesota, there were dealers who said, I'm not going to sell this car. And of course, many Jews and others refused to do business. And he started to feel the pressure and the lawsuits. Actually, one of his targets was a Jewish lawyer from Chicago who was trying to set up a potato cooperative here in Minnesota, and Ford singled him out in his Dearborn Independent. He actually bought a magazine, newspaper they call it, and that lawyer sued him and basically won. But the point is this. We know that's a dark and terrible moment, but Ford was positively the Colossus. By now, he was making half the cars in the country. He's the richest guy in the world, the most well-known guy in the world. He has plants all over Europe, all over the world, Asia, Australia. He accomplished everything he set out to do, and sometimes that's pretty scary. When you got everything you ever set out to do, now what do you do? So he was getting some pressure to come up with a different car, but he also decided to diversify into this vertical manufacturing. And to do that, he needed boats. He needed trains. He bought railroad companies. He set up his own thing. He got into airplane manufacturing, the Ford Tri-Motor. Some of you may be familiar with that. And he even had time to read my book, if you notice. So, I don't know, maybe I had some part in this whole thing. But, so the Ford fleet, his idea was, being in Detroit on the river, that he could connect up inland to half of the country just from the Great Lakes, and then you add on the Mississippi River, and you're talking about access to an awful lot of. So he would, in Detroit, he's now able to bring in all his parts, iron ore, all raw materials from all over the world. His ships can now go all over the world, pick up the raw materials, and also ship stuff out. And you can see how complicated things have gotten. So you've got all modes of transit here. You've got the trains, the boats, all these different material handling equipment. You've got the planes up there. I mean, it's just mind-boggling. We're talking, this is 10 years after the Minneapolis plant. That's how fast this world has moved. So he did buy iron mines in the range, Minnesota. He bought coal mines in Kentucky. What he would do is take his coal from Kentucky, bring it to Duluth, switch it for iron, and kind of do the loop. This is the maiden voyage of the Henry Ford. He had two huge freighters. The first voyage was a load of iron ore to Duluth. You can see it passing under there. So when we talk Ford Century in Minnesota, believe me, there's all these other ancillary parts moving around too. He had a dock up there. He had his own dock. Yeah.
Was the Welland Canal finished at that time, or was it?
You got me. When was that? This would have been in, I'm going to say, 22, 30 maybe.
I don't think so, because he wouldn't have been able to get from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic without canal there.
No, but he was very supportive of, and obviously he was very supportive of Sault Ste. Marie and some of these other locks and dams that would be connecting up to all of the various parts. And he ultimately did get ocean going. And his plan was to have barges such as this where you could actually transport lots of cars out. You can see the number of cars. This is not a Ford. This is in Duluth, but it's a different car company. But it gives you some idea of the thinking of the time as to how people were going to start using navigation as an essential element in their distribution chain. This is what he ended up. Yeah.
So would those cars have been coming into Duluth?
Probably.
There's no manufacturing plant in Duluth, right?
Probably, now that you mention it. Yeah. Those are coming in. I believe those were, it's been years, but I forgot the brand. If there's none being manufactured there, then they were coming in. And they were obviously all made, so ready to go. But you can see how many they can get on these barges. It's quite amazing. This is, when he came to St. Paul, I'm really mixing up my chronology here, but so Minneapolis was a white elephant. It didn't even work before it was even finished. So he's now thinking he's got to get to St. Paul where he can do 250 acres, single-story building, this long, 1,200-foot long assembly line. And he promised the good folks in Minneapolis, in St. Paul, that he's going to do shipping using the Mississippi River. The farmers are all on board saying, we love Ford, come here, anything you want. We're going to give you the hydroelectric dam, anything you want. So people are thinking these huge barges, and this is what we got, 25 Model Ts going down to Winona. So it was a little bit of a bait and switch. But back to the whole notion of where's Ford's head. Ford by now is just free to do anything he wants. He can just let it fly. Well, he loved navigation. He was an environmentalist. He believed that was the most green way to transport instead of railroads and coal. He believed greatly in water power. You recognize any of the other folks here? Edison. Harvey Firestone. John Burroughs, the leading naturalist of the day. So these four were great buddies. They used to go around the countryside, and they loved these old water wheels, and Ford would buy them all up and fix them and everything else. So he was major into water power. That's water power before electricity, but then quickly turning it into hydroelectric power. So part of his philosophy is he was very attached to the farming community. He's going to take these large centralized plants like in Detroit, where they had 100,000 workers, and scatter this production all over the countryside, little plants where you might have 50, 100 people. Bring the production to the farmers so they could work part of the year and go into the factories part of the year. And hydropower was critical to that. So that's kind of the backdrop to St. Paul. So Henry, his son Etzel, and other corporate executives coming out to inspect options for a big site in St. Paul. It has now become a massive political football locally, but also nationally. What we've got here is the site on Highland Park. The federal government built a dam and the foundation for a hydroelectric plant in 1913, which is the same year as the Ford plant in Minneapolis. But it sat unused because Minneapolis and St. Paul got into this huge squabble who was going to get use of the hydroelectric power. Literally. It ground the whole thing to a halt. It became a national national embarrassment. Really, the two twins made complete and utter fools of themselves. At some point, Henry Ford, well, obviously he knew about the site, but at some point he says, maybe I can kind of work my way in here. I know I didn't build the dam, and I know I didn't build the thing, but maybe the good folks in St. Paul will let me buy this site here, and I will get exclusive use of the electricity. And he was one shrewd operator. But this is what it looked like. We're talking a completely undeveloped site. There is no village near there. There's no roads out there. But this was the plan. That's the site. You got the big single-story building. There's the hydroelectric. You got to do some work to make it state-of-the-art. But you do need an auxiliary steam plant. He built a dock here, so he had all the farmers believing we're going to really ramp up this navigation. Nothing around here. You can see that. You see the tunnel here. The plant is 100 feet up. So if you're going to use the river, you got to figure out a way to get up to it. And that's what that tunnel was. So it would go under the building, and then there'd be huge freight elevators bringing it up. So materials up if you were going to use the river, and cars down if you're going to use the river. So that was the theoretical drawing. There it is. Again, not much developed around it, but 1,200 feet long. And now you see, instead of testing cars on the roof, they've got all these wonderful window contraptions up here because it's much wider. You need light to get on the inside. Of course, you do have electricity much more refined at this point. When built, it was the most beautiful plant described by many in the world. The most beautiful, the machine in the garden, kind of the proverbial philosophical thing. classically styled by Albert Kahn. The showroom. It was such a popular attraction overlooking the river. We're talking tens of thousands of people would come down and picnic on the yard, looking over. It was like looking at a beautiful museum or college campus or something. It was so beautiful. It's such an attraction. Inside, they did bring the train in, and again, the train backed out. This was challenging, but at least now you're not out in the elements in Minnesota on a platform. But you see the construction is quite different. It's all metal joists, no more concrete. We're now single story. You don't need the strength of concrete. What you need is the span, the light span for the roof. So it's all shifted over. They made glass there. Not only did they assemble cars, but they did make some stuff, including glass. But again, here's a chance to look at how stepped up rows of windows on the roof will allow to bring light inside. The big open spaces, not many columns. Concrete, you have to have them much more closely packed together. So this was a glass tray here. This kind of an interesting thing. So they still use railroad, and for the most part, they use railroad. Yeah.
Was there no artificial light inside the plant as originally?
No, there was. But that had to be upgraded on a number of occasions as new innovations were brought in, for sure. But they still relied mostly on the rail, which was up on the bluff. And this was a very interesting thing. The coal cars would come in here. Obviously, you're going to use a lot of coal, tons of coal. I mean, it's just a massive amounts of coal in these plants. And they would literally dump it. A hopper car would dump it here. And there's the hopper. And it would go under on a chute, gravity, all the way to the steam plant here underground, untouched by a human hand. There was a little bridge that crossed over here. I don't know if you can make it out there. So this thing went, I think it's 2,000 feet. And then, because the burners were below, it literally just fell right into the furnaces. It was pretty amazing. We have the assembly line. Ford's happy. Everything is cool. The workers, they're working a lot harder now. They don't sit there and walk around the car. The cars move, and when they move fast, they got to move faster. That was their badge. Kind of cute. You got the boats. You got a couple of planes and this and that and the other thing. They call it Twin City. I know that's kind of a historical oddity, but back in the day of the people thinking merger, they used to like to talk Twin City. It's one city, not cities, plural. Parts would come right into the Ford plants. Back in the good old days of the Woodies, by now Ford has bought 100,000 acres of woods and taking care of the lumber. I mentioned the tunnels. Well, as they're digging the tunnels to get down to the river, they're also learning that this sand is the most perfect silica anywhere. And they said, we're going to make some glass here. Okay, so that's what this is all about. These are the type of tunnels. So the sand was firm, but it was soft. And I spoke to workers who did this. These are like hydraulic chutes of air coming in there. So it's not that they're chopping it out. It's like the air is just like a laser thing knocking it down. They would bring it on these carts and up to the elevator. So they would have a furnace where the sand would be melted and mixed with the ingredients. And Ford developed all kinds of new techniques. This would be like, I think it's 800 feet long. The glass would come out of the furnace on sheets, not pieces, sheets. It's kind of an unending stream. And that would be the glass in this thing. The furnaces, took 2-3 weeks to get to the proper temperature. And they would leave it running 24/7. But every 3-4 years, they'd have to do some maintenance repairs and this, that, and the other thing. And whatever was left in there, the molten glass, actually hardened. So they had to chop it all out. And I used to talk to some people who, this was huge, fun stuff for the workers to grab because it was really quite beautiful. So big chunks of glass that they would take as souvenirs. And you can see from the color, it's really quite beautiful. So I got a few pieces myself. Ford was, depending upon when, at times early on a very good progressive employer. At the tail end, very, very bad. Very, very bad for the workers. During the Depression, he let them do some gardening at a lot of his sites. And this is actually behind the St. Paul plant. And that continued even right through the 50s. One thing I do want to point out, in terms of labor relations at the time, he was very hard. I had kept hearing stories from some of the retirees that they used to essentially have to walk through cattle gates to get out of the plant at night because the security guards wanted to make sure that nobody was stealing anything. And so they would go through these very narrow gates and have to put their arms up and basically get frisked as they're coming out. Well, I finally got a picture of this, and I thought, oh, now I'm really getting this. So that's what these gates used to look like. But, I mean, not a nice way to come and go in and out of work. Nonetheless, there are many legendary stories about workers that managed to get all kinds of things out of there. One guy basically had 2 lunch boxes and used to take home a little paint every night and basically had enough to paint his entire house. I mean, there's a lot of other stories like that. He got caught. Another guy was working down on the docks there in the steam plant, and he used to go fishing right from the dock during work, and he had a big fish, and he was trying to get it out, so he kind of tied it under his shirt, and when he put his hands up, the darn fish fell off the hook that he had, and he was trying to slide it out, but he got caught. So we got Henry, Clara, and Edsel. By now, Henry is kind of senile. We're talking late 30s. Has really become completely paranoid, completely hostile to workers. Edsel, he was completely horrible to his son Edsel. I mean, abusive psychologically in every which way. It's a terrible story. But his grandson, we're now on the kind of cusp of World War II. Henry was a pacifist. Things get very complicated. Edsel is dying, if not dead. His grandson, and now FDR is saying, we got to get plants making stuff, making some military things. And Henry was just too erratic and unpredictable, and he wouldn't allow the United Auto Workers in. So they kind of got Henry, the grandson, in, and finally had to force him to unionize. Clara gave Henry an ultimatum. Well, FDR said, either you unionize or I'm taking over your company, flat out. Either you unionize, either you accept the federal requirements, which is essentially to unionize, or the United States government is going to take over the Ford Motor Company. So with that threat, he had to capitulate. The woman that gave me the glass, Loretta Jackson, is sitting right here. She was one of the very few woman workers there at the time, and this was at the very first meeting where the UAW had been recognized, Local 879, and this was their first kind of grievance meeting, if you will. During the World War II, the St. Paul plant made, the plant was split, but on the backside, they made the M8 armored cars. Yeah.
I think we have to.
Yeah. So I'll go through quick. I think we're running behind. I think these are pretty self-explanatory tanks. They had a testing track in the back. There's the testing track. Notice some of the apartments here. This was top secret. Nobody was supposed to know about it. And if they opened their windows, they'd see hundreds of these tanks circling around. There's one of these on display over at Minnesota Historical. Now, on the other side of the plant, they divided it north and south, facing the river, facing Minneapolis. They were making small parts, engine parts for the Pratt & Whitney airplane, and that was mostly women. So you can see them here. Very tight security between the two parts. There was a little bit of a conveyor going on in here, but you can see how now it's a whole different kind of operation. Floods, a couple of major floods. You know, when they built it, it was a 100-year flood above that, and they got wiped out on a few of the major ones. So things got a little complicated. So I got to meet a lot of the retirees through the union. They would get together at Christmas, and one of my good buddies, Ken Mexlow, he was 90 years old. He had a stash of these. He cut these out. He had thousands of these left over, which they let him take. But here he is, back in the day when
that?
Ford had to shut down. Huh?
What was that thing he was holding up?
That was the oval of the Model A car, you know, in the back seat and the window in the back. So they would put the upholstery in and then cut it out. So he was 90 and he must have had another 1,000 of these sitting in his house. I have no idea what he was planning on doing. But when the Ford shut down for a variety of reasons, the workers were laid off. This is before unemployment or anything else, healthcare. So they would go on trips. Here's Ken and a couple of his buddies who worked at the Ford, got an old barge and went down the Mississippi River. Very few blacks worked at the Ford plant. Very few. I'm talking about, I looked at some of the employment records. Maybe for decades you would have one or two. John Banks, who was very well liked, was one of the few, started there in the 30s and worked for a long, long time. He was also a professional photographer on the side. 50s, good old happy days, making all kinds of fun cars we all remember. The deal was, everything was rip-roaring. This is Midway Ford on University Avenue. These were the golden years for the company and golden years for the union, because obviously it goes in tandem. So the UAW was very, very powerful. That was the high watermark. There's no question. That's the Union Hall. By the time you get to the 70s, things are a little dicier. The company's moving stuff overseas, and everybody's in a mad mood. It's not just about the cars; it's about everything. You know, a lot of Vietnam, you name it. Mexico, long story, but Ford shot a few labor organizers in Mexico, and Local 879 took a very active role in trying to bring this to the attention of the world. This is as the plant is getting ready to close. What saved them at the very end was the trucks. First the F-150 and then the Ranger truck. So here's the plant at the end, starting to greatly expand. You see, here's the original plant, expanded, and all the various things. But, you know, this corner right here survived intact, but everything, they took out the whole thing there. The beautiful front facade they took out. They threw it in the landfill in the river, from what I understand. Just a few pictures at the end here of the workers, done by some wonderful photographers. That's the last Ranger driver. It's an amazing photograph. Ford had a very strict policy about taking any outside photographers, but there was a Ford worker who was a professional photographer, and they just let him wander around. He has got amazing photographs, but this is a total work of art. There's just no question about it. It's a masterpiece. It's a beautiful. So I got to meet a lot of these folks. It was not a happy day when the plant closed, obviously, but the older legacy workers were protected. TCAP is the Twin City Assembly Plant. There we got it. It's all in the landfill or wherever now. The site was cleared. The kind of good news is I got them to save parts of the original building. Parts. There were some panels like this by a very, very important Detroit sculptor, Corrado Parducci. I mean, just beautiful. And they are sitting on the site in these storage containers, about 11 of them, 12 of them. We don't know what's going to happen to the parts. Nobody knows. You may have heard that Ryan Cummings has come in and have this massive plan for 200 acres, and it looks great. It looks wonderful. The good news is the Minneapolis plant has been preserved. It looks great. HGA Architects did a wonderful job there. The St. Paul plant is kind of hanging by a thread. Hanging by a thread. The state has wanted to knock it down 3 times, and we keep fighting that. And that's it. 4th century.
The St. Paul plant, where is it located?
University and Rice on the north side.
Kitty corner from the state capitol.
Yeah, very close to the state capitol. There's a nice church there, Christ Lutheran, right next to it. So do we have time for any questions? I don't know.
I think that if some of you would like to head over, I think that Hilltop will feel better if they see some of us.
Or, I'd be happy to answer questions over there too.
But if you'd like to stay, I am a little worried for them.
Sorry about having it run a little
Oh,
longer.
it was
yeah.
delightful.
Yeah.
I think we were all